He didn't just change economics. He changed the way governments think about fear, power, and money. John Maynard Keynes wasn't a politician. He wasn't a revolutionary in the usual sense, but he was something far more unusual. A man who taught entire nations how to spend their way out of despair. For centuries, debt had been treated as a sin. Running a deficit was a moral failure. A balanced budget was the sign of an honest, disciplined government, a kind of fiscal purity. Keynes flipped that completely. He argued that in hard times, spending wasn't reckless. It was responsible. He made government debt sound like duty, and saving sound almost selfish, and by doing so he rewired the logic of capitalism itself. Welcome to the Capital Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Our story begins in the ashes of the Great Depression. Imagine the world in 1930, banks collapsing, factories silent, millions without work. The old economic playbook, the one built on Adam Smith and the invisible hand, insisted that the market would fix itself. Supply and demand would naturally rebalance, prices would fall, people would buy again, and the machine would restart on its own. But theories don't feed starving families. In the real world, demand never came back. Factories didn't reopen, and terrified households stopped spending entirely. The economy wasn't correcting, it was freezing. Keynes looked at this and saw something radical. Markets don't always heal. Sometimes they get stuck in a feedback loop of fear. When people stop spending, businesses stop hiring. When businesses stop hiring, incomes fall. And when incomes fall, spending collapses even further. A downward spiral, an economic black hole. Keynes believed recessions didn't happen because people weren't disciplined enough, but because everyone tried to save at the same time. What's sensible for one family, cutting back, saving cash, becomes catastrophic when an entire nation does it together, because one person's spending is someone else's income. And when spending dies, the economy's heartbeat stops. So Keynes proposed something heretical. If private demand collapses, public demand must replace it. The government should step in, borrow money, hire workers, build projects, and put cash back into circulation. That money would create jobs. Jobs would create income. Income would create spending. And spending would restart the engine. Old school economists called it madness. Governments weren't supposed to interfere. Deficits were dangerous. Debt was a curse. But Keynes wasn't saying debt was good. He was saying timing mattered. Governments, he argued, should act counter-cyclically. Spend in recessions, save in booms, stimulus and restraint, not one or the other, but both, in rhythm. He used a simple metaphor. The economy is like a car. In normal times, the private sector drives, but when the engine stalls, the government has to turn the key, pump fuel until it catches again. Once it's running, government steps back. That's how you keep motion alive. His 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, turned that idea into an entire framework. He introduced the concept of aggregate demand, the total spending by consumers, businesses, and the government. When that demand falls, so does output and employment. And the only way to restore it is to boost spending until confidence returns. But for Keynes, this wasn't just math. Economics was psychology. He said markets were driven by animal spirits, the instincts, hopes, and fears that push people to invest or hide their money. You can't fix fear with formulas. You fix it with action, visible, collective action. When governments spend, they don't just buy materials or hire workers. They send a signal. We believe recovery is coming, and that belief becomes economic energy. But Keynes's ideas didn't spread immediately. In the early 1930s, most world leaders clung to austerity. Britain returned to the gold standard. Germany cut spending to prove discipline and slid deeper into chaos. And in the United States, President Hoover refused major intervention, convinced the market would right itself. It didn't. By 1933, a quarter of Americans were jobless. Banks were failing. People were losing everything. Then Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped onto the stage. He wasn't an economist, but his instincts aligned with Keynes's logic. When fear stops people from spending, the government must spend for them. Roosevelt's New Deal wasn't just a program, it was a philosophy. Massive public works like the Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley Authority put millions to work. The Works Progress Administration hired teachers, artists, and builders. The government became the economy's largest customer, pumping money into America's bloodstream. And slowly, it worked. Demand rose. Confidence returned. By the late 1930s, the U.S. economy was recovering, but not fully healed. It would take something far bigger and far darker to prove Keynes right. That something was war. When World War II erupted, governments spent without hesitation. Factories roared back to life, producing tanks, ships, and planes. Governments borrowed massively, not to stimulate, but to survive. And for the first time in history, unemployment vanished in the middle of a global crisis. It was a brutal irony. Total war became the ultimate Keynesian experiment, and it worked. Production soared, incomes rose, economies revived, even as the world burned. It wasn't prosperity, but it was proof. Large-scale government spending could end a depression. After the war, Keynes's ideas didn't just gain acceptance. They became the foundation of the modern world. The Bretton Woods system, post-war reconstruction, the welfare state, the long golden age of growth from 1945 to 1973. His fingerprints were everywhere. Keynes had given capitalism a second life, one stabilized by government policy, supported by social safety nets, and guided by the idea that prosperity shouldn't be left to chance. But success carried a cost, because once governments learned that spending could solve crises, they also learned it could be used constantly. Keynes said governments should save during good times, but good times are when politicians least want to save. By the late 1960s, the balance began to break. Prices rose, wages followed, and then the 1970s oil shocks hit like a hammer. Stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment together shattered economic orthodoxy. It wasn't supposed to happen in a Keynesian world, and this crack opened the door for a new school, monetarism. Milton Friedman and the Chicago School blamed government spending for distorting markets. They argued inflation was always a monetary problem. Too much money chasing too few goods. For a moment it seemed Keynes was finished. But economic ideas don't die, they hibernate. In 2008, when global markets collapsed under their own weight, governments reached for Keynes again. Bailouts, stimulus, quantitative easing. Everything he designed, but on a scale he never imagined. At first it worked. The system didn't collapse. Confidence came back. But the recovery exposed a flaw. Keynes believed government spending would reach workers and industry. But in the modern world, money flows differently. Stimulus inflated asset prices, not wages. Stocks climbed. Housing prices exploded. Inequality widened. Governments had learned how to restart the engine. But the fuel was pooling in the wrong places. Then came the pandemic, and Keynes was resurrected in his purest form. Governments printed trillions. Checks went directly to households. Central banks flooded markets overnight. For a moment it felt like magic. Markets soared, people were protected. Then the bill arrived. Inflation spiked, supply chains broke, the system strained. Keynes created a tool for stabilization. But today that tool has become the system itself, almost a century after the general theory. Keynes's logic is everywhere, and that's the problem. Governments spend in bad times. And in good times. Stimulus has become permanent. Debt has become ordinary. And economic pain is something politicians desperately avoid. But Keynes's core insight still matters. Economics runs on psychology, on belief, on trust. When confidence dies, economies die. Keynes designed a way to keep confidence alive, even when everything else fails. But here's the haunting twist. The modern world runs on belief with no boundaries. The medicine has become the addiction. Every crisis demands more spending, and every rescue makes the economy more fragile. Keynes once said, "In the long run, we are all dead." He meant it as a challenge, a reminder that governments shouldn't wait for perfect theory while real people suffer. But over time it became something else, an excuse to postpone restraint again and again. And that is the irony of John Maynard Keynes. He didn't destroy capitalism. He saved it, again and again. But in saving it, he made it dependent. fragile, restless, perpetually in motion. The man who taught governments how to spend also taught them how easy it is to never stop. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.